And welcome to the Daily Energy Markets podcast, special month in review, month outlook. It is Sunday, February 4th, our first Sunday outlook of the year. We're joined, as always, by Mike Muller, head of Vitol Asia, and Christoph Ruhl, senior research scholar at the Center of Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. Welcome to you both. Last week, we asked a question to our, actually it was on Thursday, I think, we asked our community how much geopolitical premium had crept into the oil price through the month of January, and it was a +5 or less than 5. And we found out pretty quickly a day later, because the geopolitical premiums need to drop out of the market on Friday by about $5 with the news, or at least the reporting, that indeed the parties to the conflict in Gaza were maybe inching their way through to some kind of a ceasefire, some kind of an agreement, which sapped away any of that geopolitical risk premium that had crept into the market in the preceding weeks. At least that was my reading on it. Let's kick off with Mike Muller, head of Vitol in Asia. Mike, your thoughts and takeaways from an oil markets perspective through the month of January.
Yes, I think risk premium is certainly the big debate here. I mean, it's been absolutely an avalanche of headlines. The much expected retaliation by the US, by the Biden administration. Biden, of course, under terrific political pressure in an election year, manifested itself in attacks on Syrian and Iraqi soil in terms of targets of allegedly Iranian-backed military capabilities in those areas, was followed up by attacks on Yemen yesterday, and it seems to be ongoing again today. This obviously has happened whilst markets are closed. On Friday, Brent sagged into the high 70s. We had made a high of $84.80, I think, basis Brent. So a lot of risk premium had come out of the market, but we have a market that is having to come to grips with things it didn't expect. I mean, the porosity of air defenses, for example, not just the capabilities in the Bab el-Mandeb area and the Gulf of Aden, but also in Russia have come to the fore in terms of attacks being possible on a refinery in Volgograd, which is 600 kilometers into Russia, and on energy infrastructure in Ust-Luga, which is St. Petersburg, which is a long, long way from Ukraine. And then, of course, the very graphic pictures of ships being hit by Houthi projectiles in the Gulf of Aden, quite far from the Bab el-Mandeb itself, of course, just reminding us all of the fact that the naval defenses in that area cannot cover the entire stretch of the ocean. And then the Houthis announcing that the arena was going to be expanded to the Middle East Gulf, and indeed the need for missiles to be intercepted en route to Eilat in southern Israel. The arena is very quickly spreading, and it's understandable, of course, that you get voices of concern in the US, in Brussels, about the risk of further escalation. And it was highly predictable, of course, that the US strikes would never touch Iran itself. But there was a lot of concern in the market, and the oil price does not necessarily reflect that. There have been many comments on social media and on the news about how actual oil producing capability has not been affected, but refined product capability has certainly been hit in Russia. And whilst the Russian headlines are that the Volgograd refinery is operating just fine, photographs of units on fire at night would suggest that maybe the hit was pretty much a direct one. And as for the navigability of the Bab el-Mandeb, we are seeing way more ships taking the long route around the Cape and avoiding passage in that area than most people would have expected 2 weeks ago. And that's clearly put a big risk premium into clean products markets in particular, and less so dirty. But shipping rates, of course, are reflecting that. We're seeing commensurate stock builds on water, and we're seeing some elevated concern, and therefore reactions in differentials of products markets that reflect that. The best graphic example would be distillate east-west markets, which had to reprice quite markedly middle of last week, or early last week, in fact, to ensure that any potential surplus of distillates building in Asia would be able to afford to make its way around the Cape on the longer route to get to Western markets. So
we'll pick up on some of those themes in the follow-up, Mike. Christoph, the month of January, the first month of the year, from a global macro point of view, seemed to be a month in which the U.S. economy continued to surprise on the upside. Your thoughts and takeaways from month January in terms of the global macro picture?
Well, the macro picture is not independent from the security picture. So if you allow, I will come back to that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Take some lessons from the facts Mike described. On the macro side, there's I think 2.5 major development. One is the US continues what looks to me like a soft landing with surprising strong real data, with the Fed cautioning off, markets exuberance for interest rates coming too fast. But it seems as if the direction of travel in the US is still the right one. And especially from an energy or oil market perspective, the implication would be that oil demand is relatively high in the US because economic growth has not slackened off and will not slacken off despite these stock market iterations around Fed meetings. It seems also as if China is likely to find a bottom somewhere at 3, 4, 5%, at least for the real economy, even though, as we discussed last time, I mean, when I was in China, I was shocked about the degree of gloominess of economic actors, even though expectations are very low, and even though stock markets will probably not recover against the flow of capital which wants to leave China, but they have the wherewithal still to keep a bottom under the real economy, so this will not collapse. And even Europe also is sort of dithering along. So the economy per se, I think, is not our main concern right now, but it is really this geopolitical uncertainty to which I would add the dimensions of upcoming elections and so many places.
Just before we get too deep into those points, I just wanted to follow up, Christoph, and ask you, because we did start the month of January, start the year with the financial markets betting heavily on a very early move towards the cutting of interest rates. Had betted in, I think, on the US side, 6 or 7 cuts as early as March. We ended the month with those expectations totally upended, with a bionic jobs number on Friday, 330,000, US economy in Q4 growing over 3%. What's the impact of that quick a shift on the market outlook, or is there ramifications at all?
It's more, when you come from an energy perspective, this is not very interesting. It's more hype than anything. I mean, markets expected a cut in March. Now they expect one a month or 2 months later. This is not going to change the general direction of traffic. That is, to me, all the noise which surrounds a pretty soft adjustment path. And this is something we can get excited about every day, just like we can get excited about $1 or $2 movements in the price up or down. But it's not sort of something of a major impact one should worry about, because these markets are slow-moving, the energy markets, slow-moving beasts. And what matters here is whether we are facing a recession or not. And it does look in all the noise as if we do not face a recession in the US in the foreseeable future, not even one caused by the Fed, hopefully. But so let me just give a few points on the security issue, because I think against the background of what Mike has described, one important development which we need to look out for now is indeed happening in the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. Because we know that Russia has tackled Ukrainian energy infrastructure for a long time. That was infrastructure meant to supply heat and warmth and gas and light and everything to the Ukrainian citizens. Ukrainian is striking back with its own sort of forward defense now, and has increasingly started also to attack energy infrastructure, but not the type of infrastructure which provides heat to the citizenry, to the people of Russia, but refineries, very targeted. And the reason is clear, because what they want to do is they want to disrupt the delivery of refined products to the Russian army. Right? No truck drives with crude oil, so they tackle refineries. But the implication, of course, is that this can be done without creating resistance from the G7 or from the so-called collective West, because it doesn't affect Russian crude exports, and probably not even to a large extent product exports. And that was always the West's concern, that this war could somehow end up jacking oil prices up by affecting Russian exports. Now, if the Americans continue to refuse supporting the Ukraine if Trump wins the elections. So the Ukrainians, at any rate, will or have already quickly discovered that they have a very powerful instrument there by attacking Russian energy infrastructure, export infrastructure. They have it actually, they have the capacity, and this is almost impossible to protect, to disrupt Russian crude oil outputs. And this is something they, if pressed into a corner, they will use, or at least they will use to threaten.
They could blow up their own pipeline that's still carrying gas from Russia to Europe, which is quite extraordinary. Mike, I wanted to come back.
The oil infrastructure.
And the oil infrastructure, yeah.
Because
Mike,
they can manipulate the oil price in that way, no?
Right, absolutely, and I think I just wanted to come back to this idea of disruption, which of course is the question in the Red Sea. Mike, much of January we saw obviously this disruption grow, as you said. You couldn't have imagined the market imagined 2 weeks ago the scale of disruption that is now redirecting ships and so forth. The big sort of story in a way through January, although a risk premium did grow into the price, was how unaffected the oil markets were through this fairly significant crisis in terms of at least the front end of the oil price. So, Mike, what other areas did this disruption, or did the Red Sea, how does it impact the oil markets? There's some reporting that it's sort of impacting the possibility of sort of geographically redirecting flows, that the amount of crude and products that was moving east to west and west to east is now not, and that markets are localizing. Just want to get your thoughts on that, Mike, and other impacts that this disruption at the Red Sea is having.
Yes, we need to look at trade flows that typically transit the BAB, the Red Sea. The most graphic one was that naphtha tanker, which was ablaze, and everyone has pictures in their minds of that, of course. Naphtha is short in Asia and long in the West. This particular tanker was carrying naphtha from a Black Sea Russian refinery, but there are many other flows of naphtha from North Africa, from the Mediterranean, from Europe, that come through the Suez Canal to Asia. So naphtha was, unsurprisingly, the first market that got very jumpy when the Houthis first disrupted shipping traffic. We had a view that several tanker owners were still willing to transit, and therefore the market had factored in a certain amount of disruption, where some responsible owners and oil majors had declared pretty much on day one they would no longer try and transit the Red Sea. For the most part, the ships would. As we saw this particular attack, a very large percentage of tankers carrying naphtha, hoping to transit the Red Sea, turned around. And that trade flow has definitely created a much stronger Asian naphtha market as a consequence. If you look at the second product that moves west to east, it's fuel. This was less impacted, but it was a Russian cargo of fuel that was hit by the Houthis, which came just days after the Houthis made it clear that they would be avoiding Russian and Chinese targets. And therefore that highlighted to everybody that maybe the ability to verify which ship was which was perhaps a little bit unclear also. And suddenly that meant that every tanker was at risk, rather than just tankers that had a Israeli, British, European, or US nexus. Then you look at flows going the other way. There was a structural flow of jet fuel and diesel in particular out of Middle Eastern and Indian refineries that go to Europe. And a lot of that is staple trade for the likes of Kuwait Petroleum Company, for example. And the other big flow that goes north through Suez Canal is LNG, best illustrated by Qatari LNG. Heading to Western markets. There was a lot of watching out to see whether these GCC producers and the Indians would take a view that transiting the Red Sea was still a possibility. And over the weeks that we've seen, there's been a decided decision making that these ships should go around the bottom. Now that was expected to spook LNG markets. I mentioned the impact on the East-West diesel spread a few minutes ago, but on LNG in normal circumstances, that would have seen LNG shipping rates spike, and a possible need to redirect Middle Eastern LNG to Asian markets and then leave Western LNG in the West, be it Russian Arctic, being US LNG. It just so happens that mild weather in Asia has countered this issue, and therefore not boost LNG shipping rates to a point where the Qataris and others from Asia can afford to put their ships from the bottom of Africa, which is what we're seeing. So I can go on and on, Sean, but the main impact so far on clean shipping rates, because the number of ton miles added is massive, and you can see it in international stock data. Stocks of diesel on the water have gone up markedly in the last 2 weeks, as you see diesel flows taking the long route.
Well, if you just to follow up on that, Mike, as my earlier point and what we saw on Friday, the drop in the markets based on reporting that there might be some ceasefire in Gaza, does that seem justified to you from the point of view of the market? Disruption is now possibly going to be removed?
You broke up a little
worse.
But I think the market had issues with the credibility of those headlines, because the suddenness of the alleged readiness of the Israelis and Hamas to call a ceasefire and thereby take away the reasons for the Houthis to continue blocking the Red Sea passage seemed a little bit hard to believe, and therefore the market needed to see a little bit more verification of that. And for my part, I've yet to see that, so I don't think the market's taken that all that seriously yet.
Looking forward, Christoph, to a number of the points you mentioned there, the heating up, if you like, or the outlook for the conflict in Europe, which has obviously been sort of knocked off the front pages by the crisis in Gaza. But nonetheless, we're coming out of the winter in the coming month, looking forward, and Ukraine still doesn't have its funding from the United States. Europe seems to be getting its act together to fund into the Ukraine, and we've had the decision by the US, although not connected, but nonetheless all in the same nexus, to stop providing export licenses for new LNG and sort of signaling uncertainty for the LNG market into Europe. Your thoughts as we come out of winter, can the Ukraine conflict find an end or find an extra layer of disruption and concern for Europe?
On that specific one, I think it's very hard to see an end. There's an expectation that it would slowly diminish and then freeze over and essentially come to a standstill without, like the Korean scenario, the fighting ends without an official peace treaty intact. Seems to be very far away. The fighting seems, by all accounts, to continue ferociously. Russia is not going to step down. The Ukraine is coming under pressure, and it's visible in the conflicts between politics and military. And it's anybody guess how that continues. Now, when we talk about what this means for energy markets and the risk premium, the first thing to note is the notion of a risk premium is a very dubious one, because nobody can ever see it or calculate it. In this particular case, the risk premium is tightly also tied to the excess capacity which we have in the market. And in the market for oil, the excess capacity is above 3 million barrels per day, thanks to the OPEC cuts. And that has kept a lid on prices. Otherwise, we would have seen them going up much more. But the second observation is something Mike mentioned in passing. If attacks spread from oil sort of also to the, it's no surprise that the oil tankers which are hit are the ones which deliver oil in a particular direction, right? But if it spreads to something like LNG, then we will see huge knock-on effects. That would, of course, require that the Houthis or others are either making a mistake or are willing to directly act against Qatar in that particular location. And that's unlikely for now. But there are things brewing there, and one has to recognize that Iran is extremely good at playing, so with its flexible forward defense, as somebody has called it, as playing this game of chicken, as the FT writes, with the US, and the US finding itself in an extremely difficult position between Netanyahu and trying to get control of Iran, even though everybody rightly says they don't want a war, that it's possible that the escalation ratchets up further against also the background of having sufficient reserves to avoid a big catastrophe. And that will then, the more goes wrong in the Middle East, the more the effects will become visible also in what Russia and Ukraine are deciding to do. And add to that the discussion about freezing and redistributing Russian reserves. If that would really be done, then I always said if Russia is cornered, they will do something to the oil markets. And it looks like now, as Ukraine would also, if they're really cornered, have the potential to disrupt Russian oil exports. And that means that the tensions are not going away for the foreseeable future.
Well, as people, as they get desperate, Let's look at the survey question as we sort of just take the last segment to look forward. What will impact the direction of oil prices? What will have a bigger bearing on the direction of oil prices through the rest of Q1? We did see the geopolitical premium. We've talked about that. We've Fed interest rates signaling. I mean, that the fact that any adjustment to rates are being pushed out because the U.S. economy remains robust. At the beginning of the year, you would have said with the forecast of 6 or 7 cuts that the market was forecasting a major recession to warrant those kind of cuts. Now the outlook looked quite positive, so that would be quite positive on the demand for energy, perhaps. OPEC supply cuts, will they follow through? Will they implement through the first quarter as expected, or none of the above of these three will have the biggest bearing on oil prices in the first quarter? Welcome your thoughts on that. Mike, looking out, obviously, this is early February. This is the month of the China New Year, which is on the 10th of February. Millions, hundreds of millions of Chinese on the move. What's your outlook month ahead? How big is the China piece to that?
We're already tracking Chinese statistics for what we call the big New Year migration, and the market is expecting a record, more than pre-COVID, more than 2019. But it's manifesting itself in slightly different ways.
More people traveling, more being...
Yes, absolutely. More bumps on passenger seats, but for the most part, more traveling. Chinese motor vehicle ownership has gone up quite dramatically since before COVID. So we're expecting private passenger trips to be way off the top of the precedent, but domestic air travel is also expected to be at all-time highs. The only piece in the jigsaw of demand that's missing is still international travel. So your international Chinese tourist is still very much lacking. But yes, China is expected to post big numbers, and even though the Chinese manufacturing indices have still been languishing at slightly below the 50 mark, they're not going into negative territory too badly. So, I mean, along with the bionic US jobs data, as you so nicely put it, Sean, the tech stocks performing incredibly well. Oil majors coming in better than expected results. Those manufacturing indices, not just in China, but all around the world, outperforming. And China evidently trying to stimulate its way out of trouble. The world's looking a lot more upbeat, so much so that I sense that the consensus of consultants and forecasting firms out there is revising demand growth up. I know that Christoph said before that the oil markets tend to respond somewhat glacially, but I think certainly in my little corner of the world in Asia, there's a view that demand estimates will need to be revised up somewhat, which with the price
at the moment, demand growth is about 1.5 consensus million barrels a day for 2024. You're suggesting that might need to be increased?
Yeah, I think the consensus is between the 1.5 and 1.7 range, and I think some people are talking it could be 1.8. That, of course, makes OPEC's tasks a lot easier, not least coming off the back of a month which put in your pre-read, Sean, where the month of January was a lower output month for OPEC, helped a little by the problems in Libya, of course, but there seems to be general discipline and restraint there also.
Christoph, your thoughts looking month ahead. You mentioned in your earlier comments elections, the outlook for elections, obviously the big one being in the US in November, but there was many in between. What do you think is coming in February into March that will be worth noting?
Well, you see, the present is this very complicated net of interacting factors, which is made so much more complicated because the way in which most important decision makers make their decisions becomes almost impossible to calculate. And take the US as an example. In this, the more the pre-election race heats up, the more difficult it becomes to calibrate for someone like Biden how to react to something like Iran, for someone like Trump how to react to somebody like Netanyahu, and so on. And what I'm still looking at is whether we're really stuck in this world where this Trump against this 80-year-old Biden, 84-year-old leader of Iran, there's a succession brewing in a sea of instability. And Netanyahu, I don't know how old he is, but she is also in this old age group, are calling the shots and finding it increasingly difficult to figure out what's going on. So I'm still looking at whether this is really the end game. I still personally find it hard to believe that we will see a duel between Trump and Biden. I don't think it's impossible that the Democrats decide to pull Biden under some health excuse, put somebody, they just don't have somebody over others. I still think
I mean, he does
possible
have a pretty good macro record to run on. Ultimately, I know
Biden
his
has
age is a big
no, he has a
problem,
very
but
good I think he has a good team and he has a good record, not only in macro, also in managing. I mean, he has inherited a terrible, difficult world, and he has certainly done, comparatively speaking, a very good, in my view, job at managing it. But it doesn't help when you go there. Everything people talk about is his age. When you watch television, you think the guy falls over. You know, and it's very hard to see how he could have the energy to do this job for more years, even if he's just a figurehead. That's not how people think about it. And then you see Trump increasingly losing it. I mean, you see almost half. You know, these were Republican primaries in Iowa and New Hampshire, and everybody says Trump won, but you see almost half of these voters coming out at really freezing temperatures to just tick a box to say no to Trump. You know, almost half of them. And so this is far from clear that this actually, and that puts a layer of complexity which needs to be resolved first, I think.
yeah, that's clearly.
On the
Sorry,
oil, I think oil and the economy, I don't think we see more than 1.7 demand growth. That would be very unusual. And I don't have a doomsday scenario, but I think the major managing job in oil markets is still OPEC Plus. You know, they still have these cuts, and there's something we haven't discussed, which could potentially be a very important signal and development, which is the decision of Saudi Arabia not to expand its production capacity. That's something which hasn't been sufficiently discussed. Why that is? Is it just to relieve the Saudi budget, or is it really a belief that oil demand is not peaking and they don't need this big capacity to compete, you know, on low prices against others? So.
Well, Mike, just the last word on that from a supply side. We've talked a lot about on the demand side through our half hour together, but just picking up on Christoph, although that supply side story from Saudi was 27 million barrels of extra capacity. The current outlook for the year ahead, you mentioned earlier in your comment that you know, anything above 1.5, 1.7 would be good for OPEC plus. But nonetheless, there are a lot of new supply still coming from non-OPEC plus. Your thoughts from the supply side going forward? Does it continue to be a dampening for prices more in the 70s than in the 80s? Your thoughts?
We can't get away from the fact that there is spare capacity in the market today, and that OPEC Plus have the handle on that, and therefore OPEC Plus cohesion keeps the price pretty much where they want. And I think this current plus minus around the 80 mark is pretty much where a level they're happy with. So as long as the wheels don't come off the OPEC Plus juggernaut, I think the extra demand we talked about earlier plays into the hand somewhat. I think that makes for a reasonably predictable task for OPEC Plus going forward.
Just on top of that, Mike, I mean, we have the Russian barrels last year into Asia at a discounted level. We have the Iranian barrels into China also discounted. Do they also need to continue at the same levels as last year in order for this market to be sort of in the balanced space where you're articulating?
Yeah, of course.
I think everyone's supply demand balances are assuming what you say there, Sean, and Christoph's
right.
The answer is of course. I mean, there's a bit of color around Venezuela. Of course, Venezuela is not sanctioned at the moment, but General License 44 lapses in April. And there have been noises from the White House that they might allow it to lapse if they're not happy with the democratic messaging coming out of Caracas. We have to be very careful to use that with Venezuelan oil disappearing. It will simply go back into the hands of those channels that bring it to market in a roundabout ways, right?
Iran is a more important thing because they might tighten sanctions on Iran again. That would have a bigger impact than Venezuela.
What about elsewhere? Christoph, you mentioned obviously the Saudi decision. What does it resonate to you as a sort of final word? Although was never imminent supply coming to the market, but nonetheless a fairly significant decision.
Yeah, a significant but a long-term decision. So this was about an extension of productive capacity to 13 million per year. And at least for me, this was always sort of a tacit acknowledgement that the market would get into reverse at some point, and then you would face a shrinking market, peak oil somewhere in this decade, and then a competition on price. And since the Saudis are one of the most cost-effective producers on the globe, they would win that competition, but would have to increase volumes to come to the same revenues. Now, to cancel that could have two meanings. Either there's really a shift in believing that oil markets continue to increase for the foreseeable future, for years to come, or it's just to relieve their own budget and to postpone the decision. I think it's the latter, but it's certainly a long-term issue, not what we discussed before.
Well, it certainly, I think, has sentiment impact, perhaps, in the sense of, does it discourage others to pull back on their capex investment, or does it do the opposite? Does it incentivize others to do more because it leaves an opportunity? I think that will be interesting. One might see the impact of that sooner rather than later, and I think that's possibly something to note. Well, we must wrap up our hour together. As always, wonderful to have you guys back at the table first Sunday of every month. Market looks fairly healthy, it would seem, general tone from the conversation here today. The outlook coming out of winter may be more positive than had previously been expected. We'll have to wait and see. Mike Muller, as always, thank you so much. Christoph Ruhl, thank you so much. Have a great month. Look forward to catching up with you next month in March. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.